Chapter 13. Despite my exhaustion, I lay awake a long time that night, wondering how I could possibly survive another week of lessons until such time as Hamlet came around again, and how would I manage to transcribe it unobserved? I tried hard to think of some alternative. Perhaps I could copy out the players' individual parts from their sides. The problem with that was that they had all learned their parts and seldom used the sides. What about the book used to prompt the players then? But I had seen how diligently Sander guarded it, never letting it out of his hands, let alone his sight. At last my battered brain succumbed to sleep. The following day, Sunday, the theatre was closed. I was grateful for the day off and for the chance to sleep late. In truth, I slept only an hour or so past matins. Then several of Mr. Pope's orphans invaded our room, begging for stories and horseback rides. At first I refused. Bad enough to be called horse by Nick. Now I was expected to behave as one. But when the boys pleaded with me, tugging eagerly at my sleeve, it brought to mind a picture of myself at that age, tugging at Mistress McGregor's skirts as she handed out the contents of some charity basket. Grudgingly, I let myself be pulled down onto all fours, straddled and spurred by bare feet into a sluggish gait. Sander, burdened with a pair of riders, glanced at me and grinned broadly. I shook my head in exasperation. "Make horsey noises," my rider commanded gleefully. "Nay," I protested. The boy burst out in giggles. "That's not how horses say it." After church, Sander said, "We have the whole day and the whole city at our disposal. Where shall we go?" "You decide." "Well, there's a zoo in the tower with lions and tigers and a porpentine, even a camel. But all they do is sleep. We could go to Paul's instead." "Who is Paul?" "St. Paul's. It's a cathedral. I'll pay for the crossing." Though a cathedral did not sound like the height of excitement to me, I had no better suggestion. It was another cobweb day, and by the time we crossed the Thames, we looked as though we had swum it. Sander's spirits were not dampened in the least. His long legs carried him so swiftly up the hill that I had to fairly trot to keep up. At last, we came to the huge cathedral which had attracted my awe the night of my arrival. "St. Paul's," Sander said, "the centre of things." So, now I stood in the centre of the universe. I stared about, open-mouthed, like the greenest ploughboy. The chaotic courtyard of the cathedral was packed with people and vendors' booths. Voices hung in the air as densely as the misty rain. I felt the urge to hold my breath as we plunged into the sea of bodies. "Keep a firm hold on your wallet," Sander called over the clamour. I laughed mirthlessly. "I have naught left to steal," I said. "You want to go up in the tower? I'll pay." "What's there?" "A good view of the city, and a few bats." The view from the top of Paul's was indeed a good one. Sander pointed out the roofs of the Queen's London residence far off to the west, and the Tower Prison to the east. Between the two lay more buildings than a man could count. The streets were as crooked and wayward as country streams, dissecting the city not in square blocks, but into convoluted shapes of all sizes. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said Sander. "It's like a maze. How in heaven's name do you find your way about?" Sander laughed. "It's easy when you've grown up in it." "And you like it?" "Of course. Don't you?" "Perhaps I'm just not used to it yet." "You'll come to like it." He put a hand on my shoulder. I was not used to being touched in a comradely way either, and I flinched. "Sorry," he said. "I forget that the height makes people nervous." "Aye," I said. "Let's go back down." The courtyard was no place for a person who was shy of being touched. I lost sight of Sander temporarily, but caught up with him against a bookseller's stall. "Here," he said, "have a look at this." Displayed prominently were a number of plays and poems written by W.M. Shakespeare. "Is that our Mr. Shakespeare?" "Of course." Eagerly, I searched for a copy of the tragedy of Hamlet, then realized that, of course, if it were bound and printed like these, Simon Bass would never have gone to the trouble to send me and Falconer here. He would simply have bought one. They say that if you mention the devil's name, he's likely to appear. As I turned away from the bookstall, I found that by thinking his name, I had somehow conjured up Falconer. And to my dismay, he was headed directly for us. I could not have said whether or not he saw me. As always, his hood sheltered his face. He was pushing his way impatiently through the crowd, but then he always did that. Perhaps it was not too late to avoid him. I plunged into the shifting maze of people. Sander shouted after me, "Widge, where are you going?" I did not bother to reply. I only pressed on, burrowing through the tangle of arms and legs like a hare through briars. At last I found daylight at the edge of the courtyard and turned to look back. Falconer was a tall man, and I could see the tip of his hood bobbing through the crowd. "Gog's blood," I murmured. He was on to me for certain, and he'd want the script and perhaps my blood as well. No excuses, he'd said. There was nothing for me to do but run, and no way to run but through the cathedral graveyard. Though I did not care for the company of dead folk, it was easier to make my way through them. I slipped as quietly as I could between headstones and crypts. The earth was soft from the rain, and in places from being recently turned up. It gave way slightly under my feet, making me fear that if I did not move quickly, I would sink down into the realm of the dead. Shuddering, I broke into a trot, never pausing until I reached solid ground. When I peered back through the drizzle, I thought I spied a dark figure weaving among the tombstones. I began to run again, with no goal but to get away. I trotted down one unknown street, then another, sending up sprays of water with each step. Finally, I sank exhausted onto a doorstep. If I hadn't lost Falconer by now, I never would. Unfortunately, I had lost myself as well. I had no idea in which direction Southwark lay. South, of course, but with the sun so well concealed, who could say where that was? It stood to reason, though, that if I followed the water in the gutters and kept a downhill course, I would eventually run into the Thames as well. How I would get to the far side was another matter. I would have to cross that bridge, or lack of one when I came to it. As it turned out, my reasoning was seriously flawed. After only a few minutes' walk, I came to the massive wall that encircled the city. Even I knew that the wall did not run between St. Paul's and the Thames. But by now, I was so disoriented that I kept on that street, which was at least broad and well-travelled. Finally, I found the good sense to ask an old farmer to point me in the right direction. "Turn left at the next chance," he said, "and follow your nose till you wets your toes." I thanked him and hurried on. The thoroughfare onto which I turned seemed innocuous enough at first, but after a time I noticed that each block was a bit more dismal-looking than the last. Before long, the street began to seem less like the path to the river than like a descent into hell. The prosperous merchants and busy tradesmen had disappeared, and in their place were coarse women and menacing men, bands of noisy, grimy children, and scores of beggars. Lining both sides of the street were ramshackle booths and huts constructed of any material that would keep out the weather. Hide, sticks, mud. My impulse was to turn and retrace my steps, but I told myself that I could not possibly be far from the river now. So I kept on, dodging piles of muck. I did not see the two youths until they were directly before me, blocking my path. My immediate impression was that they were large of body, with large grinning mouths and large daggers at their belts. Separately, each would have been daunting. Together, they were terrifying. I stepped back. They stepped forward. I stepped aside. They followed. "What do you want?" "What have you got?" one of them said. "Naught but the clothes on my back." He fingered the hilt of his dagger. "We'll have that, then,"